Welcome in, Whappers, where for our unusual day today, where we're missing class time due to the AP administrative work, we're going to focus on another AP ATW cram here, and tonight's topic is part 2 of the spread of communism. Last night we looked at the spread of communism into East and Southeast Asia. Major examples included the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the spread of communism into Cambodia with the Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge genocide. But today we shift the hemisphere over to the western side of the world, where, much to the chagrin of the United States, communism was starting to spread into hot zones nearby America. And I'm going to begin with Latin America. But overall tonight we're going to talk about regions where communism spread that included Latin America, but as well Central America, South America, and then we'll swing over to Africa, where a huge push by the Soviet Union to bring communism to Africa occurred. But in Latin America, there's one example that is the ultimate communist spread into Cuba. This is the ultimate example of how communism spread across the Western Hemisphere. Cuba, just to give you a little contextualization, Cuba for many years was a luxurious island resort vacation spot where many Americans vacationed or honeymooned. The United States had a long history with Cuba. In fact, that goes back to the Spanish-American War, when the United States helped liberate Cuba from Spain. Spain once controlled Cuba. It was one of their great slave depots in the Latin America Atlantic trade networks. So Cuba and the U.S. had a very productive relationship. In fact, many American businesses were in Cuba. Hotels, sugar, coffee. Cuba was a major ally of the United States. However, in the late 1950s, a major communist revolution erupted in Cuba, led by two figures whose names you need to know. And we're going to look at their primary sources, some of them tomorrow, on our primary source day. And the names to know, the first would be Fidel Castro. That's a name you're probably well familiar with, because Fidel Castro ruled Cuba from the 1960s all the way into the 2000s before he passed away in 2013, I believe, or was it maybe a little after that? But regardless of when Castro passed away, Fidel Castro is a name to always associate with Cuba's communism movement. And then Castro's right-hand man, or some would say his co-equal in the spread of communism to Cuba, was a man named Che Guevara. And we'll look at some of his works tomorrow. You may have seen Che Guevara's face on T-shirts before. I'll get into that tomorrow as well. But the bottom line is that Cuba went through a communist revolution, and Cuba's communist revolution really was a thorn in the American side, because Cuba was so close to the U.S. and Cuba had been long an American ally. And something I want to really reinforce here before we get into our next round of discussion with Cuba is that Cuba represented the ultimate anti-imperialist stance that many of these communist revolutions projected. A key important element of Marxism is the idea of anti-imperialist. That was very much a belief that the communist nations wanted to project. So Cuba wanted to get rid of its ties. The communists in Cuba wanted to get rid of their ties with the United States as part of this anti-imperialist sentiment that many communist regimes that formed projected across their countries and to their people. But Cuba would ultimately be the site of a great showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and we're going to be getting into that in just one moment. A big moment in Cuba and American relations was the invasion of Cuba led by the CIA in what was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The United States failed miserably. It was an embarrassment to John F. Kennedy's administration. And so the Bay of Pigs was a very dark moment for the United States, and it escalated tensions higher than before in the United States' attempt to assassinate Cuban communist leader Fidel Castro. But arguably the most important moment, maybe in the entire Cold War, between the United States and Cuba. Manai is going to go into a little background about an incident known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in October of 1962. So Manai, take it over.
Okay, so the USA discovered that the Soviet Union put missiles inside Cuba. Wait.
Yeah, so the U.S. discovered that the Soviet Union...
the Soviet Union put missiles inside of Cuba, and then they were going to bomb Cuba, they were going to bomb Florida, which is 90 miles away from Cuba. And then so the Soviet Union was pushing the USA to see if they were going to invade Cuba again.
Yeah, the fear that the Soviets had was that the United States was going to try to invade Cuba again. But we talked about this word in class, and so I think Manai is going to remind everybody, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, ultimately nobody fired any missiles. Like nothing was really, everything kind of cooled off, but tensions ran extremely high. And this is a classic example, and Manai, I know we talked about this word, where both sides in the Cold War, United States and Soviets, kind of pushed each other to the edge. So could you just remind everybody what that term was again?
Brinkmanship.
Brinkmanship. So this is a classic example. And I will have some visuals tomorrow on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Manai did a pretty good job explaining all that. And we're not going into the real details of it. But ultimately...
They had an agreement, right? And then Kennedy had an agreement with the Soviet Union that they wouldn't invade it again if they took the missiles.
Correct.
They didn't missile.
Correct. So Kennedy and the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, who was a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union. So Kennedy and Khrushchev worked out an agreement. Manai was right on the money there. The United States would not invade Cuba anymore as long as the Soviets agreed to pull their missiles from Cuba, which they eventually did. So no World War III, no nuclear holocaust in Cuba. Mutually assured destruction perhaps prevailed. So Cuban Missile Crisis, great example of brinkmanship within the context of communism spread to Latin America. Manai, thank you for coming on board.
Yes.
All right, for our next region where communism spread, we're talking about Central and South America. So that's all part of Latin America as well. Communism took root in many Central American and South American countries, especially as the Cold War headed into the 1970s and 1980s. The United States, once again, as it had done in Asia, took direct action to try to halt the spread of communism into South America and Central America. The CIA was extremely aggressive in helping to try to defeat communism. We are allied often with non-communist governments, non-communist dictators, which was seen by some as questionable in the ethics of the CIA in terms of the fact that the United States often supported governments that were anti-communist just for the sake of being anti-communist. Regardless, though, Central and South America were two hotbed areas of activity for the spread of communism, and we're going to get into exactly why that is here in just one moment. Okay, we got some more celebrities. Vicente, come on, you're kind of hiding in there. So we got Vicente and we got Saran from the second period here to talk a little bit more about Central America. And Central America in the 1970s and 1980s was a hotbed of communist activity. In fact, there were multiple uprisings that took place in 4 Central American countries. Saran, could you just let your classmates know which 4 countries there was communist outbreaks?
Nicaragua, right?
Yep, Nicaragua.
El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
Okay. 4 Central American countries where communist uprisings took place. The importance of these uprisings, is that the United States, who was sort of acting as a world police force against communism, the United States began to try and stop the spread of communism in Central America. Vicente, could you elaborate on how the U.S. tried to stop the spread of communism?
So the United States eventually funded non-communist armies, giving them money and supplies to fight communist countries.
And so typically, which element of the United States government, Vicente, was responsible? Say one more time.
The CIA.
Okay, so the CIA, once again, like in Cuba, we're seeing how the CIA was taking a very active role in America's ability to stop the spread of communism. But now I'm going to switch gears. Thank you, Saran. Thank you, Vicente. I'm going to switch gears over to a couple more WAP legends. We've got Mr. Alec Moore and Camille. So Alec and Camille, we're going to be talking a bit about a couple other topics. And Mr. Moore, I want to start with you. Since the U.S. was arming and paying for armies to fight against communists, but the United States was itself not really fighting, what kind of conflict is that, Alec?
This is called a proxy war, and it's when 2 countries fight, but indirectly.
So in this case, the United States was arming non-communists to fight, and the communists were most likely gaining their support from who, Alec?
The USSR.
The USSR, the Soviet Union. So this is a great example for you in short answer or essay format to write about proxy wars in the Cold War. Alec did a nice job bringing that term up. And then finally, Camille, we're going to shift gears and talk about Colombia. Because in Colombia, a very unique organization grabbed political power in the country of Colombia, which is in South America, where communism also began to spread. And the country I want to focus on is Colombia. So in Colombia, there was an organization that was Marxist. It followed communism. And Camille, could you let everybody know this is an acronym? So Camille's going to say it for us here. What group this was?
FARC.
FARC. You got to be careful with how you say it there. FARC. F-A-R-C. Now, many of you, and I'm going to come back to Camille in a second, many of you who took the mock AP, remember there was a multiple choice question about FARC and their communist activities. Camille, off camera we were discussing FARC and their role in Colombia. FARC gained a lot of their support from which class of people in Colombia?
The peasants.
The peasants. And one of FARC's biggest initiatives was land redistribution, something that had already happened in Mexican Revolution as well as other communist revolutions in Asia. And Camille, last question here, just to do a little compare and contrast. FARC's appeal to the peasants was similar to whose agenda that we've learned about this week?
Mao's.
Mao in China. Mao appealed greatly to the peasants, as did FARC in Colombia, and FARC was in power in Colombia all the way into the 20-teens before eventually Colombia's government went through a major change. So listen, there's a lot we've thrown at you here, but the team, Alec, Camille, Vicente, Saran, everyone did a great job. So moving on to our next region, which is going to be Africa. Thanks, everybody. So for one of our final segments here on tonight's ATW Cram, we're down in the conference room after being displaced during fourth hour. I've got some fourth hour students here. They're a little camera shy. So I'm just going to go out on my own here to talk about our last and final area of communism spread, and that is Africa. Africa, after World War II, we're actually going to go into great detail about this on Thursday and Friday. Africa was becoming a continent where many countries were gaining their independence from the Europeans, who had, of course, taken so much territory from Africa during the scramble. And many African countries were now gaining their independence. As a result, communism began to seep through and spread to different African countries, since Africa was now up for grabs in a new sort of way. Africa, once upon a time, was up for grabs for the Europeans, but now, in a way, Africa became up for grabs during the Cold War. Countries aligned themselves with the Soviet Union, or in some cases, they aligned themselves with American support. And as a result, Africa became one of the unknown proxy wars, to borrow a term back from Alec Moore earlier in the video. There were many proxy wars fought throughout Africa between communist governments with the support of the Soviet Union and other communist countries like Cuba, for example, which I'll get into momentarily. And then non-communist countries gained support from the United States. Many African countries, and I'm just going to rattle off a few of them in case you ever have to come up with some examples. But just to name a few, African countries such as Mozambique, the Congo, Somalia, Ethiopia, all had communist governments at one point. But maybe the best case I can give you of a communist government and a brutal civil war that lasted for over 20 years was Angola. Angola is on the west coast of Africa. It was a Portuguese colony. And when Portugal granted Angola its independence in 1975, a brutal civil war was fought in Angola from 1975 to 2002. A brutal civil war that was fought between communists and non-communists. Angola is arguably the most important proxy war in the... Someone's using the bathroom. We can hear it in here. It's kind of funny. Angola was one of the most important proxy wars of the Cold War in Africa. And the Cubans committed thousands of troops to support the communist uprising in Angola. We often don't think of Angola being a site of a Cold War battle. But regardless, why did communism appeal in Africa? Well, as it did elsewhere around the world, communism had great appeal to many peasants and lower class peoples because of policies such as land redistribution, because of policies such as social class elimination. So African countries, many converted to communism. Today, there are no communist governments left in Africa. None. They've all moved away from communism, but for a brief period of time in world history, especially after the Cold War, during the Cold War and after World War II, communism swept across Africa very steadfast, and the United States and the Soviet Union continued their proxy wars and waged conflict throughout Africa. More on Africa coming this week, but that just about wraps up Africa for today. But I think before we go, some members of the fourth are united. All right, they're going to leave me high and dry and not make an appearance on camera. There's Lily. There's Lily. Samora, Naya. There's Naya's hand. Oh, here comes some more. All right, that just about wraps up here, Africa. So we'll finish things up here in a bit. So, communism spread across the globe. We looked at it going from China to Vietnam to Korea to Cambodia with the episode of Communism Genocide. Then we transported ourselves over to the Western Hemisphere and looked at Cuba, Central and South America, and then finally Africa as a Cold War hot zone. The spread of communism, we're going to wrap this all up tomorrow by looking at some great primary sources, some excellent visuals to cement the legacy of communism and world history in your minds as we move forward. And we're getting nearer and nearer. I think the board says there, 16 days? And I got some trusted 8AC class members here. They're going to help us with concluding the video. So I'm going to step aside, let 8AC do the thing. And I think you guys know what's coming. Because as always, you got to remember how
the past shapes the future.
Yeah, all right. I like that.